The morning Arya Voss signed her name on a contract she didn't fully understand. The sky above the city was the color of an old bruise. She stood in the fluorescent hum of the courthouse hallway, her left hand curled against her ribs where the ache still lived from 3 nights ago, and she watched Captain Darren Falk sign his name beneath hers. His handwriting was large and unhurried. A firefighter's hand, broad, steady, accustomed to holding things that wanted to fall. He clicked the pen closed and passed it back to the clerk without ceremony. "That's it," the clerk said, sliding the paperwork into a manila folder. 30 days minimum before either party can file for dissolution. Congratulations. Neither of them said thank you. Neither of them said congratulations back. Arya had met Darren Falk exactly 4 times. The first time he'd pulled her out of a burning hallway on the 14th floor of the Dressler building, 17 months ago, when her then-husband Marcus had locked the apartment from the outside and gone to meet his lawyer. The fire had started in the unit below, faulty wiring, the report said, though Arya had always suspected the timing. Darren had found her in the smoke with her arms wrapped around a duffel bag she'd been trying to pack for 3 weeks, and he'd carried her out without asking her anything, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. The second time was in the hospital corridor afterward, when he'd stopped to make sure she had somewhere to go. She hadn't. He'd written his sister's number on the back of a granola bar wrapper, because it was the only paper he had. The third time was 6 weeks ago, in a coffee shop near the station house, where his sister, a lawyer named Petra, had explained the situation with the calm precision of someone who dealt in hard facts and didn't flinch. Marcus's legal team was pursuing a claim that would freeze Arya's assets for 2 years. The domestic violence restraining order she'd filed had been challenged. There were complications. There were always complications when the man hurting you had money and friends in the right offices. But there was, Petra said, one avenue that Marcus's team had not anticipated and could not easily challenge. A marriage of record to a citizen with no prior connection to the dispute would complicate the asset question considerably and would serve as additional documentation of Arya's intent to establish independent legal standing. Darren had been sitting across the table from Petra, drinking coffee he hadn't touched, looking out the window at the street. "I'll do it," he said, not to Arya, to the window, then he looked at her, "if you want." She had looked at him for a long time at that moment, trying to read the offer for what it was. A trap, a play, a calculation dressed as generosity, the kind of arrangement that would need to be repaid later in currency she couldn't yet identify. She had catalogued a lot of offers in her life, and learned to read the fine print in the way the offer was delivered, the specific angle of the person's attention, the small tells of someone who wanted something back. What she'd read in Darren Falk at that table was nothing, not nothing as in no signal, nothing as in the absence of ulterior. He had looked at her and the offer was the offer. No interest to be collected, no balance to be settled later. He was a person who had decided to do a thing and was now saying so. She had sat with that for 3 days before she'd called Petra and said yes. She hadn't told him that. She'd simply said yes in the coffee shop, with the traffic outside and the coffee he hadn't touched going cold between them. The 4th time was this morning. The courthouse, the bruised sky, the clerk's manila folder. They walked out through the glass doors together into October air that smelled like bus exhaust and dying leaves. And Darren put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the sky the same way he'd looked at the coffee shop window, like he was reading something written there. "My shift starts at 6, he said. "Petra has the paperwork, you don't have to," he stopped, started again. "You can stay at mine if you need somewhere, there's a couch, no obligation." Arya looked at him. He was not a beautiful man, exactly. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been made for a specific purpose and fulfilled it without complaint. A jaw that had been broken once and healed slightly wrong. Eyes the color of river water in November. "I'll manage," she said. "Okay," he said. They went in different directions. She made it 4 blocks before her phone buzzed. Marcus. She didn't open the message. She turned the phone face down in her coat pocket and kept walking. The city was doing what cities do on weekday mornings in October, processing itself, moving its mass from one point to another with the patient efficiency of an organism that has been doing this for a long time and expects to keep doing it. Buses lurched through intersections. A man outside a dry cleaner's smoked with the concentrated attention of someone rationing pleasure. 2 kids argued in a language Arya didn't know, while their mother looked at her phone and held their breakfast bags and projected the serene exhaustion of someone managing multiple systems at once. Arya watched all of it without appearing to watch. She had become good at this, the peripheral attention, the reading of rooms that included open-air rooms, streets, corridors, the posture of strangers. She had become good at it the way you become good at things that help you survive, not talent, necessity. She thought about the courthouse hallway, the clerk's manila folder, the unhurried scratch of Darren's pen. She'd thought going in that it would feel transactional. It did. But there was a quality to the transaction that she hadn't fully anticipated, which was that Darren Falk treated it with the same seriousness he seemed to treat everything. Not solemnly, not with inflated ceremony, but with a kind of quiet attention that said this matters, even if I don't say so, and she had not been treated as a thing that mattered in a very long time, and the sensation was stranger than she'd expected. Like stepping into a room and finding the temperature was different from what the outside of the building suggested. A recalibration required. She walked, and she breathed the October air, and she was still walking when the world came apart. There was no sound she could name. It was more like the absence of sound, a sudden vacuum where the city had been, the traffic and the wind and her own footsteps swallowed whole. Then light, not sunlight, something colder, more deliberate, something that knew it was being witnessed and didn't care. When Arya opened her eyes, she was no longer on a city street. She was in a forest that had never been on any map she had ever seen. The trees were wrong first. Too tall and the wrong color, their bark a dark iridescent blue-black like the wing of a beetle, and their canopy so high above that the light coming through was thin and silver and came from the wrong direction. There was no sun she could locate. The light simply existed, ambient and sourceless, casting shadows that fell the wrong way. The ground beneath her feet was soft, not like moss, like something that gave slightly and then pushed back, like standing on a lung. She stood very still and took stock of herself. Both shoes on, coat, phone in pocket. She pulled it out and the screen showed no signal, which she had expected, and the time, which read 11:47, which was 4 minutes after she'd last checked it on the street. 4 minutes and a world away. She breathed. The breathing was not nothing. She had spent years understanding that breathing, the deliberate, chosen kind, the kind where you tell your nervous system this is information, not emergency, was not a passive act. It was the first act of control available in a situation that wanted to strip control away. She had learned this from a therapist she'd seen briefly 3 years into the marriage, before Marcus decided the appointments were an indulgence and the money was needed elsewhere. The therapist had been named Dr. Chen, and she had been small and precise, and had said many things that Arya had carried with her afterward like tools in a pocket, taken out when needed. One thing she'd said, the body that breathes is the body that thinks. The body that doesn't breathe is the body that reacts. You want to think. Arya breath, she thought. This was what Arya Voss was, a woman who had spent 6 years in a marriage that tried to convince her she did not know how to read a room, how to read a person, how to read danger. She had survived that. She had survived by learning to be very quiet and very observant and very good at understanding the grammar of a situation before the situation made its intentions clear. She stood in the impossible forest, and she breathed and she read. The forest was not empty. She understood that before she saw anything. The way a room is not empty when someone is standing in the corner behind you, holding their breath. She could feel a tension on her like barometric pressure. She tried her phone again. Still no signal, not even the flickering no-service bar that meant the phone was trying. The phone was not trying. It was as though the relevant infrastructure simply didn't exist here, which was either because it didn't, or because whatever had brought her here was capable of suppressing it, and she wasn't sure which possibility was more unnerving. She looked at the ground again, the soft, lung-like give of it. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the surface. It was warm. Not uncomfortably warm, the warmth of something alive or something adjacent to life, something that occupied the same structural category as life without being precisely the same thing. She stood up. She looked at the light. She looked at it for a long time, trying to determine its source, its angle, whether it had any variation that would indicate a direction toward something meaningful. It didn't. It simply existed, sourceless and even, the way light exists in certain kinds of photography where the photographer has deliberately eliminated all shadows to remove the sense of place. The effect was similar, a place that was not quite a place, or a place that was not interested in being understood as a place yet. She waited. This was also something she had learned, the value of not filling silences immediately, the information that arrives when you stop making noise. "You are upright," said a voice. "This is statistically encouraging." It came from her left. Arya turned. She was standing 3 meters away, and it was, the closest word Arya's mind supplied was woman, but it was the same way forest was the closest word for this place. A shape that organized itself into the rough grammar of a standing figure. Tall. Thin in a way that implied a different skeletal logic entirely. The face was mostly eyes, large, pale, the iris the color of shallow water over sand, set in a face that was too symmetrical, like a reflection of a reflection. She wore something that resolved into clothing only at the edges, where you weren't looking directly at it. "You're not human," Arya said. "No," the figure said. "I am the arbiter of the 9th convocation. You may call me nothing if you prefer. Names are largely ceremonial." "What is this place?" "This is the proving ground. You are here because you were selected." The arbiter's head tilted at an angle a human neck could not have managed. "Do not ask how. The mechanism is not relevant to your task." "What task?" 10 salient points, the arbiter said. 10 tasks calibrated to stress test the specimen. You will complete them. If you complete all 10 within the time constraint, you will be returned to your point of origin unharmed. If you do not, a pause that was not quite a pause, more like the way a sentence pauses before the word that changes its meaning. You will not be returned. Arya looked at the forest. She looked at the arbiter. She looked at the light coming from the wrong direction. "What kind of tasks?" she said. "The kind that determine whether your species is worth continued observation," the arbiter said, "or whether the file should be closed." It was a cold thing to say, and the arbiter said it the way you might read a weather report, factual, uninterested in its own implications. Arya noted this. She noted everything the way she'd learned to note everything. The angle of the arbiter's shoulders, which were not relaxed, which suggested something the arbiter did not intend to show. The way the word specimen had landed without ceremony, as though it was the precise word and not a rhetorical choice. The fact that the arbiter had said statistically encouraging when Arya stood up, which meant others had not. "How many others are you currently running through this?" Arya said. A silence. "Fractionally longer than the others." "That information is not relevant to your task," the arbiter said. "That's not a no," Arya said. The arbiter looked at her. Those pale, wide eyes doing something she could not quite classify, not surprise, but the thing that comes just before surprise in a creature that does not permit itself to be surprised. "The first task begins," the arbiter said, "in 30 seconds. Then it was gone, not gradually, Between one blink and the next, the space it had occupied was simply air. Arya counted to 30. She did it the way Darren had once mentioned firefighters count time in a fire, each second named out loud inside the mind, given weight, so that time does not compress into panic. She had thought about that. She'd thought about a lot of things Darren had said offhandedly. The way you think about things said by people who are competent and unperforming about their competence. On 30, the forest changed. The trees she'd been standing among thinned, and ahead of her, where there had been only more iridescent dark trunks, there was now a clearing. In the clearing's center stood a structure roughly the size and shape of a doorframe, but made of something that was not metal and was not stone and hummed at the edge of hearing. On one side of the doorframe was a symbol. On the other side was a different symbol. Between the two symbols, in the gap where a door should have been, was darkness. At the base of the structure, on the soft ground, lay a person. Arya crossed the clearing at a run. He was human, young, early 20s maybe, wearing clothes that said he'd been taken from somewhere urban and recent. Jeans, a university hoodie, one sneaker on, one gone. He was breathing, barely. She knelt beside him and checked his pulse, his airway, the color of his lips. She'd taken a first aid course 3 years ago, not because she'd anticipated any of this, but because she'd spent enough time in emergency rooms with injuries she had to explain that she'd decided she should know what she was looking at. "Hey," she said. "Hey, wake up." He opened his eyes, brown, terrified. He said something that wasn't English and then switched haltingly. "The door, don't go through the door. I went through the—" He couldn't finish. His hands were shaking. "Okay," Arya said. "You're okay. Look at me. What's your name?" "Yusuf," he said. "Yusuf, I'm Arya. I'm not going through the door yet. First you tell me what happened." He told her, and she listened without interrupting, which was a skill she had refined over years of navigating a world that punished women for speaking before they understood the shape of a room. Yusuf had gone through the door because something on the other side had looked like daylight, like a way home, and on the other side had been a narrow ledge above a drop he couldn't see the bottom of, and a wind that had nearly taken him off it, and a voice, the arbiter's voice, that had said, "The span must be crossed." He had turned around and come back through the door and fallen and hit his head on the frame, and that was the last thing he remembered until Arya's hands on his pulse. "The span," Arya said, "a bridge. There's nothing to walk on, it's just air, and the voice says to cross it." Arya looked at the doorframe. She looked at the symbols on either side. She looked at the darkness between them. She thought about what the arbiter had said, 10 tasks calibrated, not random, calibrated. A word that implied design, intention, a specific thing being measured. She stood up and walked to the door and looked through it without stepping through it. On the other side, a ledge exactly as Yusuf had described, a drop, wind. And across the gap, she had to put her head through the doorframe slightly to see. Across the gap was another ledge, perhaps 4 meters away, and on that ledge was a small object that caught the sourceless silver light. She pulled her head back through. "Is there anything in your pockets?" she said to Yusuf. He checked. A phone, dead, earbuds, a receipt, a length of paracord he said he kept there out of habit, which was the most useful thing anyone had ever told Arya in her life. She unknotted it from his pocket. About 3 meters, maybe slightly more. Not long enough to span the gap, but that wasn't what she was thinking. She thought about the symbols on the frame. She'd seen the one on the left before, not exactly, but its grammar. She'd spent 8 months, after leaving Marcus, doing small administrative work for an architectural salvage company, and part of that work had involved cataloging carved stonework, and she had absorbed without meaning to the visual logic of symbolic systems, the way repeated elements carried meaning through relationship, not isolation. The symbol on the left had a vertical element and 3 horizontal crossbars descending in size. The symbol on the right was the same vertical element with 3 horizontal crossbars ascending in size. Mirror images. What went down on one side went up on the other. She stepped through the door. The wind hit her immediately, cold, lateral, deliberate. The ledge was about a foot wide. The drop below was the color of nothing, which was worse than darkness because darkness implied a bottom. She did not look down again. She took one of her shoes off. She tied the paracord to the lace. She swung it carefully, measuring the arc, and on the third swing it cleared the gap and the shoe clattered onto the other ledge. She pulled it back slowly. It caught on the edge, held. She didn't haul herself across. The ledge was too low and her upper body strength wasn't there for that. And she knew her own body the way you know a house you've lived in, every creak and limitation. Instead, she used the cord as a guide rail. Left hand on the cord, right hand on the doorframe behind her, feet moving sideways along the ledge in small, deliberate steps, testing each one before committing weight. The wind tried twice to take her. Both times she stopped, braced, waited it out. Patient the way she'd learned to be patient, not passively but as a choice, a strategy, the opposite of freezing. She reached the other ledge. She picked up the object, a small disc, warm to the touch, with the same kind of symbols on it. She tucked it in her pocket. The arbiter's voice came from nowhere in particular. Task 1, complete. She went back across the same way she'd come, slower, because the cord was slack now, and she had to do more of the work herself. When her feet hit solid ground on the other side of the door, she stood for a moment with her hands on her knees. "Good," said Yusuf from behind her. The terror in his face had shifted into something else, not hope exactly, but its prerequisite. "Come on," Arya said and helped him up. The forest gave them another task within minutes. This one was different. The clearing reconfigured, she felt it rather than saw it, the way the pressure changed, the way the two tall trees seemed to lean slightly in a new direction, and at the far end of a path that opened ahead of them was a structure like a room with no ceiling, 3 walls and an open front, and inside the room were 2 pedestals, and on each pedestal was an object. One object was clearly mechanical. One was clearly biological. Between the pedestals was a third pedestal, empty, with a recessed space exactly the size and shape of one of the 2 objects. The voice said, "Place the correct one." Arya walked into the room and looked at both objects without touching either. The mechanical one was intricate interlocking components, some moving, a small internal light source, a thing that was trying hard to seem alive. The biological one was quieter, a cluster of something like seeds or spores held in a transparent matrix, slow internal movement if you watched long enough, the unhurried work of living cells doing what living cells do. She looked at the empty pedestal. The recessed space was warm, slightly humid. She picked up the biological object and placed it. Task 2 complete. Yusuf looked at her. "How did you know?" "The empty space was warmer than the room," she said. "Living things generate heat. It wanted a living thing." He didn't say anything to that. He just walked beside her when the path opened again, and she noticed he'd stopped shaking. The 5th task had required a kind of translation. There was a structure, smaller than the doorframe, more like a lectern, and on the lectern's surface were arrangements of symbols that changed when you looked at adjacent ones, a system that rewrote itself relative to its observer. Arya had looked at it for a long time, Yusuf beside her offering technical observations about the symbol sets, and she had listened to him the way she listened to everything, not waiting for him to finish so she could say what she'd already decided, but actually listening, actually letting his observations change her model of what she was seeing. He'd said something about recursion. She'd thought about the mirror logic of the door symbols, the way 2 identical things reflected each other and made meaning in the gap between. She'd understood, suddenly and completely, the way understanding sometimes comes not piece by piece but all at once, like a room that was dark and is now lit. She'd rearranged 3 elements on the lectern's surface. The system had settled, the forest had shifted. Task 5 complete. You didn't tell me what you were doing, Yusuf said afterward. I wasn't sure until I did it, she said. That's terrifying, he said. Yes, she said, but you can be terrified while you do the thing. The being terrified doesn't have to come first. He thought about this, with the absorbed expression of someone filing it for later. She thought about how young he was, and how the forest had chosen him, and what the arbiter had called encouraging about the fact that he was still upright, and she felt the specific anger that she kept very well organized because she had no use for it unorganized. The anger at systems that chose people who didn't choose to be chosen, that made arenas out of ordinary lives, that watched from outside what they'd created and called it a test. She was going to get him home. She had decided this on the first task, without drama, as simply as you decide the direction you'll walk when you leave a building. They were on the sixth task when they found the third person. She was sitting with her back against one of the beetle-black trees, and she was older than either of them, late 40s, Arya thought, with the kind of face that had lived in weather for years. Her name was Constance, and she was a nurse, and she had been in the forest for what she estimated was 2 days. She'd completed 3 tasks on her own before something in the fourth had broken her left wrist. She showed it to Arya without drama. It was bad. Swollen, the wrong angle, clearly fractured. She'd immobilized it against her body with strips torn from her shirt. The fourth task, Constance said. There was a creature. I don't know what it was. It wasn't hostile, it wanted something, I think, but I couldn't understand what, and when I reached toward it to try to, I fell. That's all. I fell. Can you walk? Arya said. Yes. Then come with us. Constance looked at her with the specific attention of someone who has spent decades reading people in high-pressure situations. Nurses did this. Firefighters did this. Arya had learned it under duress, which was a harder school but not a lesser one. You're not afraid, Constance said. Not an accusation, an observation. I'm afraid, Arya said. I'm just not letting it drive. They moved as 3. Constance walked with the controlled movement of someone managing pain she was not going to let manage her. The wrist held close, every footfall measured. Yusuf walked with the energy of someone who had recently been terrified and was now running on the metabolic aftermath of that terror. A kind of bright, unsteady alertness that Arya recognized and kept her peripheral attention on, because unsteady alertness was useful until it wasn't. She told them both what she knew about the arbiter. She told them about the tasks as she understood them. She told them the system was calibrated, which meant it had logic, which meant it could be read, which meant they were not helpless in it. And she said this not to perform optimism, but because she believed it, because she had spent years in a system designed to convince her she couldn't read it, and had spent the subsequent years relearning that she could, that she'd always been able to, that the failure had been the system's design and not her perception. Constance listened with the careful attention of her profession. When you say calibrated, she said, do you mean it's testing for something specific? Yes, Arya said. Something it can't just measure directly, something it needs to see demonstrated. What? I'm still working that out, Arya said. But I think it's something that looks like a weakness from the outside. Constance looked at her with the expression of someone turning a thought over. Then she nodded and said nothing more, and Arya appreciated this. The tasks themselves were varied in a way that felt intentional, each one different enough from the last to prevent the previous solution from being directly reused. A puzzle of light and shadow, a negotiation with something that was not quite language, a navigation challenge in a space that didn't maintain consistent geometry, a threshold that would only open for a specific kind of approach, which Arya worked out after watching how the threshold responded to Yusuf's impatient pushing and Constance's careful clinical assessment and her own stillness, and understanding that the threshold was calibrated to something else, not force, not analysis, but a quality she couldn't name precisely except that it felt like the thing she'd learned to do in her worst years. The way she'd learned to make herself very small and very clear and simply endure, not in defeat, but in the knowledge that endurance was itself a form of power that people who'd never needed it couldn't recognize. She walked toward the threshold slowly, without agenda, and it opened. Task 7 complete. The arbiter appeared on the 8th task. Not announced, not gradually, simply present the way it had been present at the beginning, as though it had been there all along and had only just consented to be visible. It stood at the edge of the space where the 8th task was laid out, and it watched Arya with those wide, shallow-water eyes. "You have brought others," it said. "Yes," Arya said. "The tasks were designed for one specimen." "Then they needed redesigning," Arya said. "We're completing them." A pause, the inclusion of additional. "We're completing them," Arya said again, not loudly. She had learned long ago that volume was the instrument of people who had no other leverage. She had other leverage. She just used it quietly. The arbiter was silent for a moment that was slightly longer than its previous silences. "The 8th task," it said, and did not finish the objection. The 8th task was the hardest one. The space it occupied was larger than any of the previous clearings, vast, cathedral-ceilinged with that impossible canopy, and what it required was clear. Somewhere in this space was a signal, and the signal needed to be found and amplified and directed at a specific receiver, and the means to do all of this were present in the environment but not arranged, not obvious, not labeled. It was, in other words, a problem without instructions. Yusuf, it turned out, was an electrical engineering student. He looked at the components scattered around the space with the particular focus of someone who speaks a language others don't, and he started moving and touching and testing. Constance, with one good hand, organized what Yusuf needed in the order he needed it, anticipating his next step the way experienced nurses anticipate a surgeon's needs mid-procedure. Arya looked at the receiver. It was a structure at the far end of the space, and it had symbols on it, and she had been reading symbols for 8 tasks now. She understood what the signal needed to be. It wasn't electrical. That was the misdirection. The components were electrical because those were the components a human mind would reach for, and the whole point of what she was starting to understand about these tasks was that they were testing not capability but adaptability, the ability to read a situation without the comfort of a manual. The receiver didn't need an electrical signal. It needed a human voice. She had no way to be certain. She had what she'd been working with the entire time: observation, inference, the willingness to commit to a conclusion when the evidence pointed there, even when the stakes made commitment terrifying. She walked to the receiver and she sang. She didn't have a remarkable voice. She sang a song her grandmother had taught her, a folk song, something in a language she only half remembered, something about water and returning, and the particular kind of patience required when you are waiting for something you cannot make happen by wanting it. She sang it quietly, the way you sing something to yourself, not for an audience. The receiver lit. Task 8 complete. Yusuf stared at her. Constance did not stare, she just nodded once, the way a person nods when something confirms what they'd suspected. She stayed in the receiver space for a moment after the tone of completion faded, her voice still at the edge of her throat, the song her grandmother had sung about water and returning still moving in her chest. Her grandmother had been a woman who sang to things. Not for performance, she sang the way some people walk with their hands behind their backs privately as a way of processing motion. She sang to bread rising. She sang to plants that weren't doing well. She sang to Arya when Arya was small and afraid of things she couldn't name yet, sitting at the kitchen table with Arya's face between her palms, singing something soft and specific and personal in a language that was half forgotten even then, half swallowed by immigration and time, and the specific erosion that happens to languages when they move far from their source. Arya had not thought about her grandmother in a long time. The years with Marcus had done something to her memory that she was still mapping, certain corridors closed off, certain rooms difficult to access, the way a building becomes difficult to navigate after a flood. Not destroyed. Difficult. She was still finding rooms she thought were gone. She had found this one. Her grandmother's kitchen, the specific smell of bread and whatever that soap had been, the song about water and returning, and her own small face between a pair of warm hands. She turned and walked back to Yusuf and Constance, and they continued. The Arbiter was there again after the 9th task. The 9th task had been the cruelest one, if cruelty was a concept that applied to what the Arbiter did. It had required Arya to choose between two paths, with incomplete information about where either led, and the wrong choice would end the run. She had stood at the fork for a long time, long enough that Yusuf had started to shift his weight, and Constance had said, quietly, "Take your time," with the authority of someone who knows that taking your time is not the same as wasting it. She had chosen left, because the right-hand path had the faint smell of ozone, which she associated with electrical discharge, which in her experience occurred after a thing had happened rather than before it, and the task was to find something that hadn't happened yet. Task 9 complete. And then the Arbiter. "You have reached the terminal task," it said. 10, Arya said. "Yes." The Arbiter looked at the three of them, not in sequence, all at once somehow, in a way that shouldn't have been possible with eyes that faced forward. "The terminal task has not been completed by any specimen in this convocation cycle." Arya looked at it. "How many have tried?" The Arbiter's two-symmetrical face did something at the edges that was not an expression but functioned like one. "Many." "What is the task?" "The task," the Arbiter said, "requires the specimen to demonstrate a quality that the 9th convocation has designated as the primary variable in determining a species' continued viability. A quality that cannot be taught or trained or simulated. That arises only from specific conditions of history and need." "What quality?" The Arbiter turned its wide, pale eyes on Arya directly. "The quality you have been demonstrating since you arrived," it said. "We simply need to see it named." Arya looked at it. She thought about being 16 years old and watching her mother refuse to leave a situation that was killing her, not because she didn't know it was killing her, but because the cost of leaving felt higher than the cost of staying. She thought about the arithmetic of that, the terrible accounting, the way a person can understand a trap completely and still not be able to get free of it without help that comes from outside the trap's logic. She thought about a man with a jaw healed slightly wrong, who had written his sister's number on a granola bar wrapper, because it was the only paper he had. She thought about a contract signed in a courthouse hallway, while the sky was the color of an old bruise. She thought about what it meant that she was here, in this impossible forest, having completed 9 tasks designed to kill her, with a 20-year-old engineering student and a nurse with a broken wrist, both of whom were still standing. She was quiet for a moment. She let the silence be what it was, not empty, not a failure, but the space that a real answer requires before it can be properly said. The Arbiter waited. It was, she realized, the first time it had waited for her rather than the other way around. She said, "Willingness." The Arbiter was very still. "The willingness to be helped," Arya said, "and the willingness to help, not because it's strategic, not because the math works out. Because the alternative, the world where you don't, is a world you can't live in." She looked at Yusuf. She looked at Constance. "They're the 10th task," she said. "You put them here. You put all of us here. And the task isn't to outrun them or outthink them or use them. The task is to understand that you can't complete this alone, not because you're weak, because the kind of strength that matters isn't the kind you have by yourself." The Arbiter looked at her for a long time. "Task 10, it said at last, and the word that followed was in no language Arya knew, but its weight was clear. "Complete." The light changed. Not dramatically, no thunderclap, no flash, no portal cracking open with visible effort. The change was quiet and entire, the way sleep comes when you stop fighting it. The forest went silver bright for half a moment, and then Arya was standing on a city street, and the October air smelled like bus exhaust and dying leaves, and her phone had 4 bars of signal, and the time read 11:54. 7 minutes. Yusuf was beside her. Constance was on her other side, cradling her wrist. They stood on the sidewalk and looked at each other and did not speak for a moment, because some things don't fit into the first sentence. "Hospital," Arya said to Constance. "Yes," Constance said. "I'll come," Yusuf said. Arya looked down at her phone. 3 missed calls from Marcus. The unread message still sitting there, unopened, its contents still unknown to her, and she realized as she looked at it that she was not afraid of it. She had been afraid of it this morning. She was not afraid of it now, and she turned the thought over carefully to understand why, and what she understood was this. She had just been measured by something that did not know her, and it had found her adequate. Not because she was invulnerable or exceptional or built different from other people. Because she knew how to reach, and how to accept a hand reaching back. She called Darren. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping between his shift transitions, which meant he'd been waiting for something without being willing to admit that he was waiting. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "I need to tell you something that happened today. It's going to sound. Is anyone hurt?" "One broken wrist. She's a nurse, so she's handling it better than I would." A pause, the specific kind of pause that precedes someone setting down whatever they were holding. "Where are you?" She told him. He said he'd come. Not "I'm on my way," not "give me 20 minutes," just he'd come, in the same way he'd signed the courthouse paperwork, unhurried, without performing the weight of the commitment, because the commitment was self-evident and didn't require performance. She stood on the sidewalk in October with Yusuf and Constance, and she waited. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately count, waiting did not feel like losing. 7 minutes in an alien proving ground. A lifetime compressed to a morning compressed to a test. She looked at Yusuf's profile, his tired eyes, his university hoodie. The paracord still looped absently around his wrist where he'd moved it after she'd cut the length needed. And she thought about the randomness of it, the statistical improbability of 3 specific humans landing in the same forest on the same day, with exactly the combination of knowledge and temperament and history required to complete 10 tasks designed to be impossible. The arbiter had said calibrated. She had not missed that word, calibrated to stress test, not calibrated to destroy. That was the thing she kept returning to. The game had not been built to kill them. It had been built to see what happened under sufficient pressure, which meant something was genuinely trying to understand, something vast and cold and systematic and very much paying attention. She was not sure whether that was more or less frightening than the alternative. She decided it was less. In the 9th Convocation's records, filed in a format that had no translation into any human language, and was stored in a medium that had no equivalent in any human physics. There was now an entry for the species designated by their star's catalog position, and nothing else. The entry had been updated. The arbiter had updated it personally, which was unusual. Arbiters did not typically note their own observations. The data was sufficient. The data was always supposed to be sufficient. The arbiter wrote, "The specimen demonstrated adaptive coalition building under conditions designed to prevent it. The specimen demonstrated the capacity to read unfamiliar symbolic systems and to act on incomplete information without paralysis. The specimen named the terminal variable correctly without prior briefing. The specimen's most significant quality was not any individual capability, but the specific architecture of the relationship between capability and others. A structure that appears to form most readily under conditions of prior adversity, as though the adversity itself is not merely survived but metabolized. converted into a form of connection intelligence that cannot be replicated in species without equivalent history. The arbiter paused. Added, "The file should not be closed, it should be watched." Darren arrived 12 minutes after Arya called him. He was still in his station jacket, the one with the scorched sleeve that had been scorched for as long as she'd known him, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at the coffee shop window, reading something. "You okay?" he said. "Getting there," she said. He looked at Yusuf and Constance. He didn't ask. He looked back at Arya. "Hospital first," she said. "Right," he said, and got his car keys out. They drove in the kind of quiet that isn't empty, the kind of quiet that has shape to it, the way water has shape, pressing against the edges of the space it's in. Constance sat in the back with Yusuf and told him the names of the bones in the wrist in the tone of someone who finds the facts of the body comforting. Yusuf listened and asked questions and seemed genuinely interested, and Arya watched the city pass outside the window and felt the specific sensation of a hinge turning. She had signed a contract this morning. She had done it as a legal maneuver, a chess move, a means to an end. The man who had signed it with her was now driving her through afternoon traffic to a hospital where a nurse with a broken wrist would be assessed and treated. He had not been asked to do this. He had come. She had spent 6 years being persuaded that what she needed was to be smaller, quieter, less, that the natural consequence of needing help was debt, that every extension of a hand had a price attached that would eventually be called in. She had spent 6 years learning that arithmetic and finding it false in the most expensive classroom available. The 10th task, she thought, the willingness to be helped and the willingness to help. Not because the math works out. She looked at Darren's hands on the steering wheel, the one with the knuckle scar from whatever he'd never explained, the one that had held her up in a burning hallway while her own legs were deciding whether they worked. "Thank you," she said. He glanced at her, just briefly. "Yeah," he said. The way you say yeah when you mean something more, and you're not ready to say it yet. Or when you're the kind of person who believes that actions are a more reliable language than words, and you've been speaking that language so long that words feel like translation. The hospital's emergency bay was bright and efficient. Constance went in with the authority of someone who knew exactly what to tell them. Yusuf sat in the waiting room chairs with his knees up and his university hoodie rucked around him, and looked very young and very shaken, and then gradually, over the course of the next hour, looked less of both. Arya sat in the plastic chair and watched the waiting room do what waiting rooms do, which is to say it collected people in the process of enduring something, and it held them together in proximity while they endured it separately. The man across from her had a child asleep on his lap. The woman 2 seats down was completing a crossword with the focus of someone who needed her mind to be doing something specific. A teenage boy sat with his ankle wrapped in a bandage, eating chips from a vending machine bag with the serene calm of someone for whom the worst of the day was over. Arya had always paid attention to the people in rooms with her. It had started as survival, learning to read the emotional temperature of a space before Marcus came into it, before she entered a room where he already was, the preemptive intelligence gathering of someone living in a situation that rewarded advance warning. She had resented the skill while she'd needed it. She'd come to understand it differently once she didn't need it for survival. It was attention. It was care. It was the specific human practice of remaining curious about the people sharing your oxygen, even when the circumstances didn't require it. The arbiter had measured this. She was increasingly certain of it. She thought about what the arbiter was, something vast and old and systematic that had devised a series of tests for a species it wasn't sure deserved to keep existing, and had been surprised. She thought about what it meant to surprise something like that. She thought about the fact that the arbiter had been watching many others before her, in this convocation cycle alone, to say nothing of other cycles, and that most of them had not made it to 10. She thought about what humans were when they were at their worst. She had a personal catalog of that, vivid and detailed, and she did not flinch from it because flinching from it had never helped her understand it. And she thought about what humans were when they were at whatever the opposite of their worst was. Not their best, necessarily, not grand gestures, not heroics, not the things that got remembered. The everyday version of the opposite. A man writing his sister's number on a granola bar wrapper. A nurse in an impossible forest telling a frightened young man to take his time. A song remembered from a grandmother in a half-forgotten language about water and returning. The arbiter had wanted to see it named. She had named it willingness, and that was accurate as far as it went, but sitting now in the hospital waiting room with the fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights do to everyone, she thought the fuller name was something harder to say. Something like the specific human capacity to remain open in conditions designed to close you. To keep extending, keep reaching, keep singing into receivers in alien forests, on the slim but non-zero chance that something on the other side is listening. Marcus's message was still unread on her phone. She opened it. She read it. It was what she'd expected. Legal language and threat, and the particular brand of contempt that expresses itself as pseudo-concern. She read it once, thoroughly, because she had always believed in knowing the full contents of a threat. Then she forwarded it to Petra and put the phone away. An hour and 20 minutes later, Constance came back out with a properly set and splinted wrist and the expression of someone who has been managing their own medical situation all day and has finally been permitted to put it in more qualified hands. 8 weeks, she said, not as bad as it felt. Good, Arya said. Yusuf stood up. He was taller than she'd realized. The university hoodie had made him seem smaller. He looked at Arya with the directness of someone who has decided to say something and committed to it. I don't know what you did today, he said. I don't think I'd have gotten past the first one, but I don't know, I think you're, he stopped, tried again. I'm glad you were there. I'm glad you had paracord, Arya said. He laughed. It was an unguarded sound, startled out of him, and it was the first laughter she'd heard since the courthouse hallway, and it landed in her chest like something that had been missing from a room and had come back. Outside, in the parking structure, Darren was leaning against his car reading something on his phone. He looked up when he heard them coming. His eyes went to her immediately, a professional's assessment, a fast scan for the things that need to be addressed, and then settled. Everyone accounted for, Arya said. Good, he said. They drove Constance home first, then Yusuf, and each drop-off had the quality of something beginning rather than ending, which was not a quality Arya had associated with goodbyes for a long time. When it was just the two of them and the city's evening lights coming on through the windshield, Darren said, You don't have to tell me. I know, Arya said. I want to. He drove and she talked, and he didn't interrupt except twice, both times to ask questions that were the right questions. Not the questions about the arbiter's biology or the mechanics of the teleportation or the specific nature of the tasks, but the questions about what it had felt like to stand in an impossible place and have to decide who she was. The first question was, when you stepped onto that ledge, what were you thinking? She thought about it honestly. I was thinking about the cord, she said. I was thinking about physics. I was thinking in very small steps because the alternative was to think about the whole thing at once, and the whole thing at once was too large. Right, he said, just right like she'd confirmed something. What, she said. That's what it is in a fire, he said. The whole thing at once will kill you. You go room by room. You go one decision at a time. The whole thing exists, but you don't think the whole thing. She looked at him. You knew that before you were trained. He glanced at her. How'd you know? Because you learned it somewhere that wasn't a classroom, she said. People who learned it in a classroom explain it differently. He was quiet for a moment. Then, my dad, he said, not fires, something else, but same principle. She didn't push. The second question came about 10 minutes later, when she was describing the 10th task, and the moment the arbiter had asked her to name the quality. "What did you think about?" he said, right before you answered. "You," she said. And then, because she believed in accuracy, "Not only you, but you were part of it, the granola bar wrapper, the way you signed the paperwork this morning." The city lights moved across the windshield. He didn't say anything for a long time, and she was comfortable with that because she had learned the difference between silences that were the prelude to something difficult and silences that were simply the sound of a person integrating information. She appreciated that. It was, she thought, consistent with who he had been every time she'd encountered him. By the time she finished talking, they were parked outside the coffee shop, where Petra had laid out the legal situation 6 weeks ago. Neither of them had planned to be there. He'd just been driving, and that was where they'd ended up, which felt like something, but she didn't have a name for it yet. "What happens now?" he said. Not about the marriage contract, she understood, about all of it. "I think something is watching us," she said. "As a species, I think we're being evaluated, and I think the evaluation isn't based on what we build or how fast we move or how much of the universe we understand." She paused. "I think it's based on whether we can do this." "What's this?" She thought about how to say it. "Stay open," she said, "to each other, after everything that tries to close us." He was quiet for a moment. The streetlights had come on. Inside the coffee shop, through the window, a couple sat with a single cup between them, passing it back and forth, and an old man read a newspaper with the focused attention of someone for whom reading a newspaper is a form of meditation, and a kid in a backpack fell asleep over an open textbook, their face peaceful in the way only very tired faces become peaceful. "That seems manageable," Darren said. "It isn't always," Arya said. "No," he said, "but that's kind of the point." She looked at him. He was looking at the coffee shop window the way he always looked at things he was reading carefully. November River eyes. "Come on," he said, "I'll buy you coffee." "I thought your shift was at 6. "It is," he said. "That gives us time." She thought about what it meant to be watched. To be the subject of an evaluation conducted by something so far outside human scale that its patience was not patience, but simply the natural state of something that had a different relationship to time. She thought about all the things humans had been watched doing, all the ways they'd been their worst, the wars, the cruelties, the specific human talent for identifying what was most precious in each other and using it as a weapon. The arbiter had presumably seen that too. Had presumably watched enough to know that it was in the data, that it was part of the species profile. And had still not closed the file. Maybe because the data also included this. A woman with a bruised jaw and no signal on her phone standing in an impossible forest, choosing to help a frightened stranger before she helped herself home. The data included that too, and apparently the arbiter had decided, with whatever passed for careful consideration in a 9th convocation, that the second thing was more interesting than the first. She found, to her own surprise, that she was glad to be interesting. She looked at the paperwork on the back seat, their marriage contract, redundant now in all the ways that mattered, a legal document that had tried to solve a human problem and had been outpaced by something realer and less legible. She thought about the arbiter writing its report. She thought about the file being marked watched, not closed. She got out of the car. The coffee shop was warm. It smelled like coffee and rain coming, and someone's food order from the back, and underneath all of it, underneath everything, the ordinary, unremarkable ambient miracle of people gathered together in a lit room against the dark. Arya stood for a moment in the doorway, taking it in. A habit she'd developed over years, the habit of the threshold pause, the moment before you enter a space when you read it and it reads you and you both decide. The habit had been born of fear and had become something else. Attention, the deliberate practice of being present to where she was. She was here, an October evening, a city she'd lived in for 11 years. A coffee shop she'd sat in before, for reasons that now seemed like a very long prelude to something she hadn't been able to see the shape of at the time. The table by the window was empty. She took it. When Darren Falk came in behind her and sat down across from her, unhurried, no ceremony, the scorched sleeve of his jacket catching the warm light, she looked at him with the kind of attention she'd spent years calibrating, and she thought, this is what we are. Not the grand version. Not the version that makes the records, the ninth convocation files. The quiet version, the ground level, the iteration that keeps happening in lit rooms while the stars conduct their long deliberations. This is what we keep being. In burning hallways and impossible forests and courthouse hallways and hospital waiting rooms and coffee shops on October evenings when the streetlights are just coming on. The coffee arrived. Darren wrapped both hands around his cup the way he had at the other table in the other meeting that had started all of this, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the moment had the quality of a breath held before you decide to trust the ledge with your weight. She thought about the arbiter, the pale, wide eyes, the too symmetrical face doing the thing at the edges that wasn't an expression. She thought about what it had written. She didn't know it had written anything. She didn't know about the report, the updated entry, the notation in a system that had no translation into any human language. But she felt, with the particular precision of someone who has spent years learning to trust what she feels without apology, that somewhere something vast and attentive had looked at this moment. This table, this October evening, these two cups, this not yet anything that was already more than its parts, and had made a decision. Not the decision she'd expected when she woke up this morning. Not the decision she would have predicted at any point in the last 6 years. The decision that said, keep watching. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the window. Outside, the city moved through itself in the amber and blue of evening, enormous and indifferent and full of people making their 10,000 daily choices about who to be and how to reach, and whether the hand you extend will find another hand or empty air. Usually empty air, sometimes not. That was it. That was the whole math. The arbiter had wanted it named, and she had named it willingness, but the full name was longer and harder, and she thought she might spend the rest of her life getting closer to it, which seemed like a reasonable way to spend a life. What are you thinking? Darren said. She looked at him. That it was a good morning to sign paperwork, she said. He looked at her with those November river eyes for a moment, and then something shifted in the set of his face. Not a smile exactly, more like the thing underneath a smile that makes it real, and he said, yeah. Outside, the city continued. Above it, unseen and unhurried, something was watching. Open, reaching, singing into the dark on the chance that something is listening. Worth watching,